Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Green Book Pod, produced in association with Lib Dem Podcast. Our aim in this series is to explore the major challenges facing the country and discuss what the Liberal Democrat response should be. We'll be featuring both external experts and party insiders. My name is Duncan Brack. 10 years ago, I was part of the team that wrote the Green Book, New Directions for Liberals in Government. We aim to contribute to the debate about the challenges facing the next Parliament and the need for innovative green solutions that the Liberal Democrats could adopt. Now, 10 years later, the political context is obviously very different, but our belief remains that there is a massive opportunity for the Liberal Democrats to set out an agenda for making a real difference, but only by identifying innovative, radical, and robust solutions with realistic strategies to deliver them. So that's the aim behind this podcast series. In October, we looked at the economic challenges facing the country, and in November, the challenges of reaching net zero. In this new episode, we're discussing the question of the Liberal Democrats' position on Europe. So I'll hand over now to Julie Smith.
Thank you, Duncan. So I'm Julie Smith. I'm Professor of European Politics at Cambridge University and the Liberal Democrats spokesperson for defence in the House of Lords. So I'm sort of double-hatted for these purposes. The aim of this podcast is to address one of the key issues facing the next government, the future of UK-EU relations. Liberal Democrat policy on the topic is clear: to improve the relationship between the UK and the EU, aiming to put the UK in a position credibly to apply to join the single market, and in the longer term, the EU itself. However, over the last few years, the party's campaigning and messaging has largely avoided dealing with these issues, not wishing to repeat the errors of the 2019 election, and avoiding alienating former Leave voters or anyone who's concerned about returning to the chaos of 2016 to 2019. In this episode, we're going to consider these issues. Is our existing policy right? How should we deal with the topic during the election campaign in a way that maximises our vote and sticks to our values? In order to do this, I'm delighted to introduce four guests. Two will be well known to the party as our candidates and former MEP, and two will be well known to some, but perhaps slightly less well known to others. The first of our guests is Anand Memon, Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London, and Director of the UK in a Changing Europe programme, which is a fantastic, effectively a think tank that looks at findings of social scientific research, makes them available to academic and non-academic audiences, and has particular interest in Brexit. So we're very much looking forward to Anand's thoughts about Brexit and the Liberal Democrats. The second guest is Luke Tryl, UK Director of More in Common, an organisation that was set up after the tragic death of Jo Cox in 2016. More in Common aims to be a thought leader, a strategy and communications consultancy, and an incubator for on-the-ground initiatives to tackle specific challenges. Luke's background is in public opinion research and education policy. And obviously, public opinion research is exactly the sort of thing that key strategists are going to be thinking about ahead of the election. Turning then to somebody who is well known to the party and also been thinking about strategy, Lisa Smart. She's the Liberal Democrat prospective parliamentary candidate for Hazel Grove, a seat we held from 1997 to 2015, and also briefly in 1974. Lisa is a councillor on Stockport Metropolitan Borough Council, which is currently Lib Dem run, and has also been chair of the party's Federal Campaigns and Elections Committee. Last but not least, Caroline Voaden. She is the Liberal Democrat prospective parliamentary candidate for Totnes, and in 2019, she was elected as MEP for the southwest of England and Gibraltar, and she led the Liberal Democrat group in the European Parliament until the UK left the EU in January of 2020. So welcome to all of our guests. I'm going to start by asking our two experts from outside the party to give us their thoughts, and then I'll come to our two Lib Dem candidates a little bit later. So firstly, the background. Anand, Can you tell us a little bit about the impacts of Brexit, in case people have forgotten, perhaps? Could you maybe tell us a little bit about the economic effects of Brexit for the UK economy?
Well, I mean, the top line, thanks for having me, Julie, by the way. The top line is that there has been a Brexit economic impact. It's very, very hard to be precise about that impact, not least because there's so much noise. I mean, COVID and lockdown, the war in Ukraine, there are an awful lot of things going on that impact on the economy. But I think the data is pretty clear that there has been some kind of impact. It's been varied. It's not been precisely the impact that people predicted. So one sort of standout anomaly in the numbers is that UK services exports to the EU have held up far better, I think, than people would have anticipated. My own hunch is that part of the reason for that is actually COVID, which is that because people during COVID got used to exporting services virtually. Academics, lawyers, architects, whoever it was, got used to doing precisely this, talking on Zoom. And I think a lot of services exports are now done in that way, which has helped the numbers. But in terms of goods trade, there is a clear impact. Colleagues at the LSE have estimated an impact on food price inflation of up to 6%. There are an abundance of anecdotal tales from businesses, both large and small, talking about the hassles they're facing now because of checks. We should also bear in mind that in the trade figures, even though trade has not been damaged as badly as some of the worst case analyses would have it, one of the interesting changes in our trading relationship with the EU is the number of discrete trading relationships has shrunk, which seems to indicate that while larger companies have managed to cope quite well with the implications of Brexit, quite a lot of smaller companies have ceased trading across the UK EU border. And the final thing I should add is that, of course, the government has still not put in place the border checks on our border that they are meant to do under the TCA. They keep promising to do so. The latest date, I think, is January next year. And when that happens, we can expect a further impact on trade.
Thank you. And turning to Luke, how has public opinion changed since the referendum?
Well, I think you can broadly talk about 2 or 3 stages of public opinion. We obviously had that vote to leave the European Union. It was relatively close, that famous, what's now become famous, 52 to 48 ratio that we all talk about too much. And then when the decision was made to leave, there was perhaps more enthusiasm for it. We then saw the 2019 general election, which Boris Johnson ran on that platform of getting Brexit done. And I think it's really important to emphasize, because it matters to how people think about Brexit today, that people's vote, a good deal of the votes for Boris Johnson, were more focused on the getting done bit of Brexit than the Brexit bit itself. And that was quite simply because having had 3 years in which our political system had basically become paralysed by debates about Brexit, even some Remainers, a good chunk of Remainers, were just like, actually, I want all of this to stop. And actually, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives at that time were offering the clearest path to making the Brexit rows stop. Let's fast forward then to today, what you might call the sort of third stage of views about Brexit. And I think it's fair to say that the public do not think it is going very well. In fact, the proportions who think Brexit are going well, it's about a quarter of the public in our polling, as other polling as well, but that say it's going well. But what's interesting is that feeling that Brexit isn't going very well. Obviously, as you might imagine, those who voted Remain think that quite strongly. But actually, a significant chunk of people who voted Leave also think that it's not going very well. And if you look at polling, therefore, on whether we should rejoin the European Union, actually starting to enjoy a reasonably significant lead in the polls. It's somewhere between sort of 55 and 60% on a sort of straight question. If there were a second referendum, would want to rejoin. So in this sense, it's not gone well and people would like to rejoin. The challenge, I think, is, and I think this is where focus groups give you a slightly different perspective to that headline polling, is going back to that sense of exhaustion with rows about Brexit. When you start to talk to people in focus groups about the idea of having another referendum campaign, having more debates about a closer relationship with Europe, suddenly people start to get this look of horror in their eyes during the debate. So the way that I sum it up is that for lots of people, Brexit and approaching closer relationships, perhaps in the future with the EU, is a bit like that old maxim about how children should behave. People sort of want Brexit to be seen and not heard. People want, people are happy for sort of quiet things to go on, I think, in the background. And there are very few people that are sort of screaming betrayal. But the vast majority of people certainly don't want Brexit rows to be brought back to the forefront of public opinion and political debate.
Thank you. I was going to sort of ask a supplementary, really, which is, before the referendum, before people got actively engaged in 2016, there was a bit of a sense that the electorate split into three parts: Remain, Leave, and the undecided, but that the hardcore on both sides was about 10%. Do you think that has changed very much? Or if we drilled down a little bit, we'd find that actually the passionate rejoiners might be about 10%, and those who say we were right to leave under any circumstances is probably around the same number?
I think what's interesting is that, obviously we spent a lot of time talking about Brexit and the European Union, but the truth is actually, yes, for lots of people, it's really dropped down the list of priorities. In the run-up to 2019, it was right at the top of all of our issue trackers. Today, you look at it, and actually it's somewhere around kind of 10th, 11th on ours. People just don't see it as a live day-to-day thing. And that's, they think that that's a good thing. The other thing which we found, which links directly to what you've just asked, is that there appears to have been quite a significant degree of what we call Brexit depolarization. So when we asked in 2020, how important was your Brexit identity, whether you voted Leave or Remain, to your sense of personal identity? It's actually about half the public said that it was important to them. Fast forward to today, and that's dropped by about 11 points. So it's now just over a third who say that it's important. So it's definitely decreasing in salience. But the most interesting thing is that Brexit depolarization hasn't been equal. So the number of leavers who say that Brexit and how they voted was important to their identity has actually fallen by almost 20 points. It's really gone down. Whereas the number of people who voted Remain, it's only dropped by 4 points. And there are a number of possible explanations for that. One is, well, obviously, like the Brexit side won. And so, Brexiteers were like, I've got what I wanted. But the other explanation, of course, it links back to that sense of it's not going very well. And therefore, there are a few Brexiteers who are like, actually, I don't want to associate myself with that or being that part of my identity. But still, that said, even though it's depolarized, still significant chunks on both sides who do say, actually, this matters to who I am. And I would say it's probably about 30% on either side, with 40% in the middle, for whom don't think about it very much at all.
Thank you. Obviously, the purpose of today is to think about the UK-EU relationship, but in particular also to think about Liberal Democrat policy on this. And we do have a very clear policy. People may not be aware of it, but we do have a very clear policy set out in a paper called Rebuilding Trade and Cooperation with Europe, which was agreed in 2022. And in that paper, we recognise that although rejoining the EU is still the party's objective, the UK is going to have to spend some time forging a much stronger and healthier relationship with the EU and its member states than the current government has constructed, or than the Labour Party appears to be contemplating. So we've set out 3 preliminary steps, unilateral measures that the UK could take, such as improving foreign policy cooperation, joining EU agencies and programmes such as the European Aviation Safety Agency or Erasmus+, and deepening the trading relationship, including negotiating a veterinary agreement for trade in food and livestock. All of these are intended to create the conditions necessary for the UK to apply to join the single market, which we think is crucial in restoring the British economy. These measures, we think, can be defended in their own right as essential to economic prosperity and a better relationship with our nearest neighbours. But we also think they're steps towards enabling us eventually to apply to rejoin the EU. Anand and Luke, what do you think? Is this a credible package? Anand, over to you.
Blimey. Depends what you mean by credible. I mean, let me just play devil's advocate and come up with some reasons why it might not be. Firstly, it is not necessarily the case that the European Union is falling over itself to negotiate with us at the moment. They're bored of us, and more to the point, they've just got loads of other things dominating their agenda at the moment. If you look at what's going on in the European Union at the moment, whether it is the problems they're having with countries like Hungary, whether it's migration, they've got negotiations coming up for the next 7-year budget package, and I suspect they've got the mother of all fights coming up over enlargement with Ukraine. There's not much space for them to start worrying about us. And whilst it's hard for us, Brits, to imagine that we are not the primary consideration of our neighbours, I think the sad truth is we're not. So, I mean, that's the first thing. Secondly, I think a lot of the sorts of things you mentioned, Julie, we'll negotiate a veterinary agreement, we'll do an SPS agreement. It sounds easy. It's not obvious to me either that the EU wants to do those things, because they're pretty happy with the status quo, because who'd have guessed it, they're actually suffering economically far less as a result of Brexit than we are. But they will want things that they want out of those negotiations as well. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is we look at two of the big negotiations this year, both of which on the surface should have been pretty easy. Firstly, the negotiations over Horizon. Horizon was foreseen in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It is an absolute positive sum game. It is a win-win for both sides. So academics in the EU, academics in the UK were begging their respective governments to let it happen. And yet the negotiations got bogged down and took 6 months, even though that should have been a very, very easy win for both sides. Second set of negotiations are ones that have been ongoing with the French about youth mobility. Now, in theory, this was a bilateral negotiation between us and Paris. It's got slightly multilateralized in the sense that the Commission is trying to get involved. And it has proven to be incredibly difficult. Even talking about, under 30s coming over here to do bar work or school trips, this has got bogged down in bureaucracy and politics on both sides. And I think both those negotiations serve as salutary warnings that even the things where we say, well, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? Everyone stands to benefit, we should do it, prove to be far, far harder than we think. So it's not easy to negotiate these things. It will take a long time, which calls into question sort of political time horizons. We live in an age, and I think this has been particularly marked since the referendum, where when politicians talk about long term, they basically mean Friday. Let's get ourselves through to the end of the week and reassess there. Anything to be negotiated with the European Union, I think we should work on the assumption that it will probably take at least a parliamentary term to do so. When Canada negotiated mutual recognition of qualifications with the European Union, I mean, it's not a massive thing. I mean, it's important, but it's not a huge deal. But it took them 9 years. So we're talking about the need for a government to come in and negotiate something which will bear no fruits before the next election. Not only that, the sorts of things we're talking about, which, the sort of trivial stuff around the edges, which Labour are also talking about, veterinary agreement, SPS, mutual recognition, they're important. They're important if you import or export animal products. They're important if you're worried about the Northern Ireland border. They are utterly trivial when it comes to macroeconomics. So in terms of that impact on the UK economy as a whole, negotiating an SPS deal will not move the dial. So you're talking about negotiating things that take a long time, that might be difficult, that involve political capital, and will give you next to no noticeable economic benefit. as well. So that's one of the reasons why I think, my hunch is, even if we get a Labour government after the next election, it might quite quickly prove to be the case that relations with the EU are not a priority because they're simply not worth the candle. So there's me challenging you slightly on that. We can come back to the single market where I'm even more sceptical, I have to say.
Well, I was going to turn to Luke. Given the scepticism we've already heard from Anand, what do you think about the UK applying to rejoin the single market? Bigger than the other steps. Is it credible? Is it possible within 5 years, or is it a pipe dream?
I think it is, I think to be polite, going to be very challenging to see a pathway to rejoining the single market. And I think, again, if we're thinking about public opinion, you only have to look at last week's reaction to the net migration figures to understand why it would become, such an electric third rail in our politics. As I said, there aren't many areas where people would scream Brexit betrayal or undermining of what's happened. I think rejoining the single market and what would come with it, freedom of movement, would be what would trigger that reaction from people. And I think you've got to remember, we will most likely, by the time of, if this were on the cards under a Labour government or a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition, have a new Conservative leader who is likely to be even more Eurosceptic than the current leadership. They would very much want to use this as a wedge for people. It would bring Brexit rows right back into the fore and place whoever was in government as the antagonist on the issue. And I think the key thing to remember is, no matter what, the sort of rights and wrongs of the referendum, that framing of control really matters to people. And the single market would actually be worse on both elements of control, because not only would we, lose control of immigration, and people still say control over immigration is more important than absolute numbers, but at the same time, it would we wouldn't have the voice in shaping those decisions. So I think it's a double loss of control for people. So that's why I'm very skeptical about it, at least in the immediate term.
Thank you. Anand, I was going to mention the fact you'd already said you were quite skeptical about how much the Labour Party would do, but you obviously want a two-fingered intervention to come back.
Yeah, just to build on what Luke said, I think we underplay the problems involved in a country that is as large and as bolshy as the UK, pretending to be Norway. Being a rule taker across the board. Just imagine the media coverage of the first bit of EU regulation about financial services, over which we have no vote, but which will apply in its entirety to us. The more I think about this, and this is opinion, it's not based in fact, but the more I think about this, I think there's a sort of, we face another Brexit cliff edge, which is we either rejoin or we don't enter the single market. Because actually, just on the face of it, rejoining, at least you can argue we get to shape what goes on. Whereas I think simply joining the single market, I suspect, for all the reasons Luke said, and there's the budget as well, which isn't going to get any smaller in the context of potential Ukrainian accession. The budget, freedom of movement, and being a rule taker, I just think politically that's just incredibly hard to imagine at the moment.
Thank you. I think it's time to bring in our two PPCs, who I know have various thoughts on some of these issues, because from a party perspective, obviously, we're looking to the next election. And it doesn't seem that long since 2019 in some ways, but we're off again for, maybe a year, maybe until May. So not quite clear when the election's going to be. But what should we be thinking about? Lisa and Caroline, how do you think the Liberal Democrats should deal with the issues around the future of the EU-UK relationship in the general election campaign? Lisa, shall I start with you?
I think people win elections when they talk about things and present solutions to the issues people bring to them. And so if you're knocking on doors and people are talking to you about how they can't get a GP appointment, they can't get their children into a school that doesn't have RAC in the roof, they can't turn the heating on, I think that's what we need to present solutions on. Now, we all know that there are relationships between the various issues that we're talking about, and a crappy Brexit deal makes all of these things worse and harder. We get that. But talking to people who voted 8 years ago in a referendum that, well, I'm sorry you got that wrong, and therefore we're going to undo what you think you voted for, I don't think is a way of winning people round to our way of thinking. So you asked Julie how we should address it. I think reactively rather than proactively is a key thing. So there'll be some people who really, really care about these issues, really, really do. And I think we've got a good story to tell, both about our track record and about how we have a much more positive plan than pretty much anybody else talking in UK-wide politics, or in GB-wide politics anyway, would address these issues. I think also it's about framing sometimes. So if we're writing an article in the New European, we'd probably word that slightly differently to one that we're writing in the Express or the Mail. So I think it's we do it reactively, we do it in a way that brings it back to issues people tell us they care about and prove repeatedly that they care about, rather than just things we as Liberals and as Liberal Democrats really, really care about.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with Lisa that I think talking about it reactively rather than proactively is probably a wise thing to do, for all the reasons that Luke and Anand have mentioned about sort of bringing back the ghost of Brexit debates past. We really don't want the next election to be a rerun of 2019. I do think that I personally feel that I would like to see the party leadership not pivot away from the issue when they're asked about it, because there have been occasions when they've been asked about it in interviews and there is a pivot away from, I'm not going to talk about Brexit or rejoining or anything like that, I'm going to talk about the NHS or the cost of living, because that's what people care about, right? So we know that the NHS and the cost of living are the most important issues, and we hear them all the time on the doorstep. And that's what we have to address, and that's what we have to focus on. But I do think when we are asked about our policy on Europe, people are crying out for politicians to be honest and to stop the deceit and the kind of just the general sleaziness that we have oozing out of this government. And I think if Ed, for example, is asked about it, I think he should be absolutely honest and say, yes, it is our policy to try and get back into the single market. Full stop, the end. Now let's talk about something else. Because if you try and not talk about it, it looks as if you're either embarrassed about it, you feel awkward about it, you don't want to admit that that's actually the policy, maybe you don't agree with it. I think that actually comes across much worse than just straightforward honesty with the public and saying, we've always been a pro-European party. Half our membership joined over Brexit. I joined the day after the referendum. This is why we're here for a lot of us. Let's not be banging the drum and shouting about it at the moment, because that's not what people want to hear, but let's not pretend that that's not the case. So that's what I would like to see. And I also think that there are occasions when it could be useful to link some of the problems that we're seeing in the UK at the moment with what happened 8 years ago. The NHS, the staffing crisis in the NHS, for example, all those European doctors and nurses who just went home and didn't come back. Yes, that there's a whole argument about immigration, but the figures that came out last week were for legal immigration, for people who are coming here to work. The only reason we didn't have that debate prior to 2016 was because people didn't notice, because, EU migration flowed both ways. We went to Europe, Europeans came here, and maybe people didn't mind so much if the people who were coming in to work in our economy were from neighbouring European countries rather than further afield. So that's all about framing, isn't it? About the fact that we need these people to come and work in our economy. And if we opened up the single market to have free movement of people again coming from Europe, maybe those immigration numbers of people from further afield would fall dramatically.
So hang on. I mean, it's worth saying our immigration, the latest immigration numbers were over double the ones. I mean, if you think back to May 2016 when the ONS released that bombshell just before the referendum that numbers were 303,000, which was then, I think, a record. And they're 700,000 now. So this isn't simply a case of replacement, is it? This is this is something far more structural.
But it's a much bigger debate than the Brexit debate, isn't it? You know, the whole immigration debate is not about Brexit anymore. It's happening everywhere. It's all over Europe. It's all over the world. And it's going to get worse and worse and worse as climate change increases and we start having climate refugees. You know, we haven't even scratched the surface of it yet.
Can I take us back to UK-EU relations, though, because questions of small boats and so on at the moment are more likely to be dealt with, I suspect, between the UK and France on a bilateral basis. But we get back from migration to a slightly wider scope. Lisa, did I see you'd like a right of reply?
I think it's important to say that as Liberal Democrats, we think overall immigration is a positive and a benefit to the United Kingdom. And as somebody descended from some immigrants, I'm very pleased that we as a party think that for all sorts of reasons. But I wanted to pick up on something Caroline was saying and talking about I guess it's the intersection between policy and campaigning. And there's a reason why political parties have separate teams who deal with these things. So we've got lots and lots of thinking done about policy and then about campaigning and about communications when we're asked about that policy. And it's a different skill set to build a good, compelling policy and then to communicate it in a way that attracts people to vote for us. I think Caroline made a really interesting point about the way our leader and others respond when they're being interviewed. And I think if you've got 6 minutes on Koonsberg or Sophie Ridge or whoever, do you want the clip to be getting into the weeds about our policy on relationships with the EU, or do you want it to be something where actually somebody's going to go, oh, well, they've got an idea about how to fix the health service, how to make sure I can get a GP appointment. And so that's the reason for the pivot, because we've only got so much airtime, there's only so much real estate on this space, is to go to absolutely answer truthfully, so accurately, but not necessarily completely, and then pivot to what we want to talk about. And I, as somebody who is seeking to represent a part of the country that voted to leave the EU, so 52-48, in line with the rest of the country, I'm very keen that we talk about things that people bring up with me on the doorstep and the ways we want to address the liberal answers we've got to the problems people face. I'd much rather that than all the clips being of Ed getting into the weeds about our EU policy.
Yeah, but that's not what I said. And I don't think Ed should be getting into the weeds about our EU policy. I think if he's asked directly, is your policy to rejoin the single market, I think it's much better for him just to say, yes, it is. But what I really want to talk about is what's happening to the NHS.
So we've got obviously the on the doorstep questions. We've got what does Ed do on Laura Koonsberg or other programmes. We've also got the question of what are other parties going to be saying and doing. Lisa, you suggested that we have the best policy on this. So we can be reactive rather than proactive, but we've got the best policy. Anand, do you agree?
Depends what you mean, I think. Labour gets a lot of criticism for its Brexit policy, but I think its Brexit policy makes perfect sense in the context of being 20 points ahead in the polls. I mean, people are saying, oh my God, how can Keir Starmer stick with a policy like this? I would just turn to any opinion poll and say, that's how. My job is to win the next election. And actually, this seems to be a strategy that is working at the moment. The interesting one for me, apart from the Lib Dems, and actually I was slightly taken aback where Caroline intimated that Ed isn't awkward or embarrassed about your party stance, because I assumed he was from every single interview where he's been pressed on it and hasn't liked to talk about it. But it's been quite a curious thing watching Lib Dem figures be interviewed about this, because I couldn't quite make up my mind whether they were essentially ditching the policy or just slightly ashamed about it and keeping it. It's an interesting situation. But the other one is the Conservatives. The Conservatives obviously want to weaponise values issues. There's a very good reason why the Conservatives want to weaponise values issues, because they created a values coalition in 2019 that's now falling apart. The problem is it is quite hard for them to do so when such a high proportion. We did some work with Public First a few months ago, and we found that 80% of Leave voters don't think Brexit is going well. And the majority of those people think Brexit isn't going well because the government has screwed it up. Not because, I mean, that's the other thing worth bearing in mind is those Leave voters, I think only 16% of the Leave voters now say they vote Remain. The others actually think it could have worked, but they've been let down by the government. And the majority of them think it still will work. That is to say, they think eventually Brexit will turn out okay. So I think what the Tories do about Brexit will be very interesting indeed. And I think at the moment, they're hoping and praying that Starmer changes his position so they can beat him with a stick for it, rather than having anything positive to say themselves. So I think where Labour are makes sense. I say this with a heavy heart, having spent most of yesterday being attacked on social media for saying it. But, why would you change a Brexit policy that seems to be working? The one thing I would add, and I'd be interested in Luke's opinion on this, is that John Curtis has come out quite strongly saying not only that Labour could possibly do more on Brexit because they're disproportionately attracting Remain voters, but mainly because there are more people who now say they'd support Remain than there were. But he's also said, I remember quite clearly at Lib Dem conference, that the Lib Dems are missing a trick by not being more aggressive about this because there are votes to be had. I don't know what Luke thinks about that.
Far be it from me to disagree with John, who knows far more about lots of this stuff than I do. My worry is for the Labour Party is twofold. Firstly, we've seen even on stuff which we know is popular and they've already announced, like the 28 billion, they often act as if they're scared of their own shadow. And my fear is actually presentation is that even if it were strategically the right decision for Labour to start showing some ankle about closer relations, they would be so spooked that actually it would come across as kind of, that they didn't really believe it and they weren't really seeing it. And you could see them very quickly backtracking in the face of fire from the Conservative Party. So I think given the model of leadership they've got at the moment, even if it were the right thing, and I'm not convinced it is for them electorally. I agree with Anand that you're 20 points ahead with your current position and a bit of fanciful thinking about how we're going to smooth it all over on the margins. Just kind of stick with that from a strategy point of view. With the Liberal Democrats, one of the things which interests me the most is the nature of the Liberal Democrat coalition. So when we dig into questions about the European Union, we have a group, we call them established liberals. They're sort of similar to sort of blue wall voters is the best way to think about them. They are more pro-EU than the average. In fact, some of them might have switched Liberal Democrat at the last election, but they were too worried about Jeremy Corbyn, to be frank. That's the main reason they stuck with the Conservative. But you've obviously got that group. But then you've also got this big swathe of former Liberal Democrat seats in the Southwest and elsewhere, which obviously, Caroline, a lot more about, which were some of the most Brexit voting regions of the country. And so it would seem to me, and I don't profess to be an expert in this, that what the Liberal Democrats would essentially be doing if they pushed to go even further in terms of relationships with the EU would be making a choice about their future coalition. They would be pivoting much more towards those Liberal Democrat adjacent seats in the so-called blue wall, so, around the home counties, and perhaps risking alienating some of those more traditional Labour seats in places like the southwest of England. Now, that might be the right strategic choice based on electoral realignment that we've seen. Counter, of course, is that we know that the Conservative, if you look at election results, the Conservatives are bleeding support the most in areas that voted Leave. generally about elections. It's been termed a sort of boomerang effect. Those areas which swung most towards the Conservatives are actually the ones which are swinging back now. So there actually might be more potential for the Liberal Democrats in those kind of former heartland areas. As I say, I don't pretend to have an answer on that, but it does seem to me it would be making a choice about where the future of the coalition is.
Thank you. So we've got a policy that I outlined earlier is a clear approach to saying we should move to better relations with the EU. And I assume nobody would say we should have worse relations with the EU. But given the final points are rejoin via the single market, is there a danger in having such a policy if we don't then talk about it? Somebody has already mentioned the fact that we're known as the most pro-European party. If we don't talk about it, will our opponents not simply say, well, they're just hiding their true views and values? Caroline, no.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a danger. And I think it's really important for us to show the difference between ourselves and Labour. I think that being not Tory is not enough. I mean, it is for a lot of people, and they think that, you know, all we need to do is talk about how badly the Tories are doing, and we're not the Tories, so therefore that'll help us win in the so-called blue wall seats. But I think, especially if you look at what happened in mid-Bedfordshire, where it was a three-way race, and you know, it's fair to say that there'll be far fewer constituencies in the country where it really is a genuine three-way race than in constituencies where, you know, it's either going to be Tory Labour or Tory Lib Dem. But I think there are situations where, you know, we need to be able to differentiate ourselves from Labour, particularly if we're in a Labour-facing seat. I mean, I'm not sure if Lisa's a Labour-facing seat. No. So, you know, everybody knows how I feel about this. You know, this is why I got involved in the party. But I just think that, you know, we are constantly at 10% in the polls, 10 or 11% in the polls. And, you know, Luke's saying that 55 to 60% of the country would actually vote to rejoin now, right? You know, and even more would say that they think Brexit is a bad idea. So I don't really think that we would be doing ourselves a disservice. You know, the people who would be most upset about us talking about this probably were never going to vote for us anyway. And I know that, you know, I'm knocking doors every day now, and I'm in a Leave area as well. And I just come across people all the time who admit that they voted Leave and they kind of wish they hadn't, or they say, well, it's not really worked for us, has it? You know, Brixham is a huge fishing port. It's in my constituency. Everybody there says that, you know, they're managing and they're getting by. But, you know, the guy who has to send a taxi 50 miles to get a vet to sign 17 pieces of paperwork every single time his boat lands, and for the paperwork to come back in the taxi so that his muscles can get on a lorry and get to France in time to meet the pickup, you know, and often don't make it. You know, the whole thing is really a bit of a fiasco, and people are trying to make the best of it, and they're trying to make it work, but they can see that it has, the barriers it has put up are so immense. So I talked to one guy the other day who works in offshore renewables. I had no idea how he voted on Brexit. I didn't know it at all, but he said to me, if you got into power tomorrow, what's the one thing you would do to start turning this country around? What's the first thing you would do to just make people feel a bit of hope? Because, you know, we'd had a long conversation about how awful things were. And I thought, well, I've got no idea how this is going to land, but I'm just going to say it. I said, the one thing I would do is put us back in the single market straight away. And he was like, hallelujah. That is what every business in the country wants to hear, because it would just give us a bit of, you know, just make us feel that it wasn't all so bleak and gloomy, and that, you know, it would be good for business and good for the economy. So I personally don't think that we would be doing the Lib Dems a disservice by being a little bit more open and brave about the existing policy we have agreed as a party.
All right, thank you. Over to Lisa and then Anand.
So because it's the Lib Dem podcast, and because somebody on their bingo card will have proportional representation, I am going to talk a little bit about first past the post. So I agree with a little bit of what Caroline said, but not most of it. So I agree that we would go up in the polls from where we are, which is about 10%, 10, 11, give or take at the moment, and maybe up to 15 if we banged on more about Europe. But under first past the post, it's not about 15% in the opinion polls. It's about getting to 40, 45, 50 in those target parliamentary seats. And those target parliamentary seats that we're facing at the next general election are mostly, almost exclusively, against the Conservatives. And so those people who were looking to switch their votes, people who were 2019 Conservative voters, we need a proportion of them to vote Liberal Democrat this time, and we need to squeeze that Labour vote. So people not being able to write a thesis on the difference between Lib Dems and Labour policy on lots of things is okay in those places. Now, Caroline, you and I could write an awful lot about where the Lib Dems and Labour differ. And if we couldn't do that, then we're not in the right jobs, right? So we can definitely do that. We don't need voters to do that. We need to talk to those people who would naturally like to vote Labour, but they live in a Lib Dem Tory marginal. And so we need to convince them that voting for us is the right thing to do. We need to squeeze those votes. And for some people, not being the Tories is enough. And I think at this election, more than it has been in the last few elections, it's either Conservative or not Conservative for lots of people. I think the other thing is, while people might agree with us on some things, it's the salience of it. It's how much they care, how much is it going to swing their vote. And while they might in their head think, yeah, they've got the right answer on this, is it going to shift them? Is it going to give that emotional resonance that maybe some other issues bring? And so I'm quite comfortable with us being exactly the level of open and bold that we currently are.
Anand.
I think I agree almost entirely with Lisa, to be honest. I think the salience thing is a real issue. One of the things from our public first polling, the one thing that really united Leavers and Remainers in our focus groups and our survey work was they didn't want to talk about it anymore. You know, they were fed up. And I don't think, you know, and even though a lot of people might say, if there were a referendum today, I would vote to rejoin, I think the vast majority of those people would be furious with anyone who actually called that referendum. So, you know, that's where the problem starts. I think, I mean, I wonder whether looking forward, our relationship with the European Union just goes into that bucket of things that we know will create growth, but that people aren't interested in voting about. You know, the British people don't vote for growth. They don't vote for infrastructure investment. They don't vote for skills training. And I wonder whether Brexit doesn't just get added to that list of things, which we know if we could do it, it will be beneficial for growth. But we're just not sure we could take people along with us on what would be quite a long journey to get there. So I think for the moment, at least, you're doing it probably right. In the medium term, one of the questions that fascinates me is if the economy one of the reasons why we see this negativity about Brexit at the moment is that I'm pretty convinced that voters blame Brexit for far more of our economic ills than it's actually responsible for. Okay. You know, we're in the context of a cost of living crisis, a little bit of which is down to Brexit, but the vast majority of which is down to other things. And I do find myself wondering that if, and it's a big if, you know, we manage to achieve a little bit of growth, if the economy starts doing better again, do some of those same people turn around and come to an equally erroneous conclusion, which is, you see, Brexit's working now. So I do wonder how stable the current situation is, because I think for some people, Brexit is a sort of proxy for the state of the economy, even though that, of course, is not solely down to Brexit. But I mean, so I don't know after the next election where you should go, because I think public opinion is quite volatile. But I think for the moment, talking a lot about Brexit is probably going to put people off. And it's enough, I think it probably is enough not to be the Tories. It is enough to do essentially what Labour are doing, saying the Tories have signed a Brexit deal that is bad for the economy, we'll improve it, but not in ways that are likely to irritate you.
But earlier on, Anand, you said in response to our PPC's comments that you assumed that maybe Ed Davey or others in leadership in the party weren't very comfortable with the policy because they weren't talking about it. So is there a problem for the Liberal Democrats having a clear policy and then not talking about it?
Well, no, I always assume that that's just a question of party management. you've got to turn up at annual conference and persuade a lot of people who I suspect are going to be disproportionately in favour of doing something radical when it comes to the European Union, that you're listening to them. I mean, this is just, that wasn't meant to make it sound as sordid as it did. I mean, that's just the reality of running a political party, isn't it? Is you've got to keep the militants happy, you've got to try and attract the voters. And sometimes that requires a little bit of balancing.
Thank you. So, as we're coming towards the end of the podcast, I think one last question for Luke. Lisa has said if we had PR, if we had a more Remain campaign, then we might get up to 15% in the opinion polls say. But in the absence of PR, that's not really going to do the party very much good. Do you agree? And is there a messaging approach that the party could potentially take?
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with Lisa's assessment and the way that she framed it. I actually think, if we had a proportional representation system, there's space for a very pro-EU party, actually probably on about 20% of the polls. But you are facing first past the post with a very inefficiently distributed Remain vote across the country. It does require the Liberal Democrats to win over former Conservatives, and the thing is, they are doing at the moment, and I do agree with Anand that actually there is a large degree to which not being the Tories is enough at the moment. We had a poll about a month or so ago which showed that 75% of people thought it was time for a change of government. You don't really get those types of numbers in lots of polling. Now, not all of them will want Labour or the Liberal Democrats, but there is the theme of the next election, and we saw Sunak trying to ride it himself a little bit, not very successfully, is one of change. People aren't happy with the status quo. And so from a kind of sort of both party management and a electoral strategy, I agree with Anand. It's a sort of thing that you can have as a principal aim, but you've got to, in terms of dealing with the electorate, recognise that it's just not up there. The salience thing is so important. In every focus group we do, it is number one, people want to talk about the fact that they're still having to put stuff back at the end of the weekly shop. And they want to talk about the fact that they can't get a GP appointment. And some want to talk about small boats and migration as well. And the problem is, if you're a politician that isn't focusing on those three things at the moment, it starts to look to the electorate like it's a little bit self-indulgent, like you're engaging in things which actually aren't concerns to my daily life. So I actually think that both Labour and the Liberal Democrats probably have it about right at the moment. I think the interesting thing will be how the Conservatives, to go to Anand's point about values, try and make these wedges. So do they try and exploit that wedge between what Ed Davey is saying in interviews and official party policy? Do they try and do the same with Starmer as well? And I actually think that's probably the bigger test and risk to the current approach.
You. So final round of whistle-stop questions, and I'm going to take the panel in reverse order. 2 questions. What's the headline policy that the Lib Dem election manifesto needs to include to encapsulate the party's message on the future of EU-UK relations? And what's the best message for candidates on the doorstep? Caroline, and we've got about a minute each. You're muted.
Sorry, there had to be one. I think for me, it would be that we would immediately start taking steps to restore the damage that has been done to our relationship with Europe.
For the manifesto and on the doorstep?
Well, on the doorsteps, for me, it's a bit difficult because I just talk about my real world experience of working as a member of the European Parliament, and that trumps any kind of myths and lies that people want to throw at me about what the EU is, does and means. So that's always been my approach.
Thank you. Lisa.
I think we have recently agreed party policy, and I think that's what should make it into the manifesto. I think we worked hard to get it sufficiently detailed that it should cover most questions that come through. In terms of messaging, should candidates list the 4-step plan in all their details? They've probably not got quite enough time to do that in every doorstep conversation. But I think it's take your lead from who you're talking to. I think there will be things that you can agree with them on, whether they voted leave, remain, didn't vote, regret, would change their mind now or otherwise. I think that our plan, as it is, our 4-stage plan that ends up with rejoining the single market, I think addresses most of the issues, maybe not as quickly as some party members would like us to, but I think that gets us there. Talk to people about things they care about, take your lead from them.
Luke.
I mean, I would go with, the Tories' approach to Brexit has messed it up. We definitely want to have better relationships with our closest neighbours, and we're going to take steps to make sure that we're doing that without doing anything too radical that undermines the 2016 vote. If I were talking to people on the doorstep, I would really try not to talk about this at all and just focus on cost of living, the NHS and public services.
Thank you. Anand.
I mean, I couldn't have put it better than Luke, really. Woolly positivism about the UK-EU relationship as a national platform without mentioning too many specifics, and on the doorstep talk about the cost of living and not being the Tories.
Thank you very much. What all of you've missed is the standard campaigners' tool of look at the potholes, but obviously we have elevated it to EU-UK relations, kept it at least at the national. So thank you very much indeed to all 4 of our participants. I hope you found this an interesting podcast. I've certainly enjoyed chairing it and hope that further podcasts will be coming your way soon. Thank you.